and someone said, what are we going to call this school? And so I remember kicking around in my brain. I couldn't come up with anything. So I was like, how about the Neighborhood Academy? And Lucy said, yes, I love it.
I could have sworn it was the other way around. That's the great thing about getting two people's memories together. Doesn't matter.
And Lucy and Ricky commence.
I had a child. I had my own interior design business. I worked out of the house. I had a youth group that I was working in Larimer, Garfield, and Northview Heights 3 nights a week. And I went to seminary all at the same time.
Oh my gosh, I was coaching lacrosse at the College of Worcester and went through counseling and crisis intervention training. I thought about getting an MSW and being licensed and hanging out the shingle. That just didn't fit. I thought about graduate school in psychology, and I'm terrible in math, too many numbers. I thought about a master's in theology, but that, again, it becomes a question of figuring out what is it you're going to do with your life. I read Scott Peck's The Road Less Traveled, and I woke up one morning at 3 o'clock, and I thought, seminary. Because Peck in his book talks about combining mental health with spiritual growth. I thought, where could I mesh both those interests? I almost had enough courses at Worcester to be an English major and a religious studies major. So I applied to seminary, and quite to my surprise, they accepted me. So it was at seminary that I met Jodie. Originally, the plan was going to be getting a PhD in English until I found out how many PhDs in English there were out there. And plus, by the time I was a senior, I'd gotten sick of English criticism, literary criticism, and the rest happened from there.
So I was reading the newspaper one morning, and I saw an article about a young man, a guy in his 30s, who happened to have been dead attractive, I have to admit, so that kind of drew me to the article. And he had a street ministry. His name was Dan Myers. He had a basketball and Bible and van street ministry in Pittsburgh, working with young guys. And while I was reading the article about this man, and he was pretty phenomenal what he did, I heard a call to ministry. I heard a voice say, this is what I want you to do. So there's a long story that goes with that. I won't bore anybody with it, but that is what took me to apply to seminary.
Well, it's an interesting story of paradox. So she's working in the streets, and I'm teaching and working in counseling services at Shadyside Academy. And was thinking about becoming a chaplain in a boarding school and then moving on and teaching at the college level. And so I was coaching lacrosse, and 2 of the kids on my team, their parents were friends of Jodie's, and they kept referring us to each other. Like, you should meet Jodie more, or they would say to her, gee, you should meet Tom Johnson. And then one day at the mailbox, we met.
I tell the story better. Because this is actually how it happened. So I had some people for dinner one Saturday night, 2 of them who were Jay and Randy Ferguson, who were the parents that Tom was talking about. And Jay did tell me, you really need to meet Tom Johnson. You know, he's my son's lacrosse coach at Shadyside, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, how will I recognize him? He said, oh, you can't miss him. He said, he's very big and he's very black. So I said, well, okay. So a week or so later, I'm standing at the mailbox. And so the mailboxes at seminary are a whole big wall of mailboxes, you know, the little boxes like this. And so I'm standing at mine, which is sort of eye height when I'm standing doing this. And all of a sudden I felt the, hairs on the back of my neck start to prickle. And I turned around, and they're doing the same thing with the mailbox. Right up there was this very big, very black man. And I went, you must be Tom Johnson. And that's how we met. Well, after we met, Tom was intrigued with the idea that I was running several youth groups, and we got to chatting, and I said part of the problem was, so I'd been working with these kids since they were about 10, but they were now 15, 16, 17, and the boys really desperately needed a male role model. So while I was, sharing that with Tom and talking about the limitations that a woman can have on a man, and they're just things you need to talk to boys about that a woman can't do. And Tom volunteered, and I thought, this is fabulous. And I had approached other African American men to see if they would help, and nobody was really interested. So the idea that Tom was interested was fascinating. So I was very excited. This guy wants to participate. So fast forward, first youth group, Tom shows up. They couldn't stand him.
My usually charming self.
They hated him. This was a colossal bust. And Tom and I have subsequently analyzed it, and some of it was because he imposed a stricter ethic than I was used to imposing. It was youth group, it was after school. As long as I could keep the kids contained in a way where they weren't constructive, I allowed a fair amount of, hustle and bustle, so to speak. The other thing was,
not my strong suit.
the boys were jealous. It was absolutely fascinating. I've never seen anything quite like it.
Freud would have had a field day with
it. They bristled. I was theirs, and all of a sudden, here walks this man into their, environs, seems to have a really good relationship with me, distracts my attention from them to him, and then proceeds to tell them what to do. No, thank you. This was not going to work. So I think Tom sort of faded into the woodwork in my youth group, but he started his own, which was much more successful, out of his church on the north side. And over time, we would meet at Ventos for lunch from seminary. And we started talking, both of us agreed that what these young kids needed was not rocket science. It really wasn't. It was the same upbringing we would give our children, plus a good education. So Tom, of course, looks at me and says, well, why don't we start a school? And like an idiot, I didn't say, are you kidding me? I said, oh, that sounds like a good idea.
Well, it began, let's rewind the tape a bit. I won them over in the youth group by teaching some of them how to drive. I had this old beat up Chevy, one in a long line of old beat up Chevys. I was committed to not paying more than $300 for a car at any given moment. And this last old beat up Chevy, I'm surprised it passed inspection.
It had a hole in the floor.
It had holes.
You could see the street when you were driving.
And the reason I taught them to drive in that car was you couldn't do anything else to it, right? It was beyond damageable, if that's a word. So she would go off every summer to Michigan to retrieve her sanity. And so mom left the kids with dad. What does dad know how to do? School. So we began a summer program at the basement of my first church. And we started out with, I think, 8 kids. And the hook was we paid them $5 a day to come.
Let me interrupt you there. So I had read a book called The Urban Christian, which is still obviously out there, by a guy named Ray Bakke, who was a white minister who took a church in an African-American inner city neighborhood. And his task was to revitalize the church or close it. So week after week after week, nobody came to church. It didn't seem to matter what he did, how he preached, what kind of activities he offered. So he sat down and said to himself, what is the problem here? And all of a sudden he realized that, and it really was a stroke of genius, he realized that the only thing of value that people who are very poor have is their time. And so he began to pay them for their time. So he wouldn't necessarily pay people to come to the service, but he'd pay people to put out the cookies after service. He'd pay people to make and put out the coffee. He paid people to do the flowers in the church. He paid, so, on and on and on. And what he realized was, and then he would give free food, and he'd give out certificates to the Giant Eagle. If you came to church, you got a certificate to it wasn't the Giant Eagle, but whatever the grocery store was in the city in which he worked. And over time, what happened is the church filled, and he no longer needed to pay people because they came because they wanted to, because there was community, because they were being fed by the service. So it almost is the same philosophy that you have when you start teaching your children chores. In the beginning, you pay them to make their bed or to do or whatever, but after a while, it just happens. So I looked at Tom and I said, there is absolutely no reason why a high school teenager will come to a summer school. None. Let's assume parents aren't going to require it or parent. The kid could presumably be getting a job somewhere and earning money to help for the family. And they frankly have better things they have to do with their time in the summer than to go to school again. So why don't we pay them? So that's how this idea came up.
So we began the first year with, I think, 8 kids. The second year we had 15 or 20. The third year we were probably 30. And then 40. Then by the time the program ended, just before we opened the neighborhood academy, we had close to 50, 60 kids coming every summer.
And how it worked was you were paid a stipend per day. If your actions were such that you needed to be severely reprimanded, you were docked pay. And if you did something extraordinary, you got a bonus. And then you weren't paid until the end at a graduation ceremony where you graduated from, it was a 6 weeks program? No.
5.
5-week program. You graduated from the 5-week program and you got a check. Or no, you got cash in an envelope.
The second or third year, there was an interesting progression. Carolyn Abrams, who was a reporter from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, called me and said, I've heard about this program. And so she spent the day with us. And I think there's still a copy in, quote, the archives of this article. The next thing I know, someone from KDKA radio called me. The next thing I know, I'm about ready to leave for vacation. And someone from the Associated Press called. And so they ran an article, and it ran nationally. I started hearing from people I hadn't heard from in years. And then finally one day was, hi, my name's Greg Sapchuk. I'm a producer with CBS This Morning. So sometime after that, she and I sat down in Ventos, and I ate some food that my PCP no longer allows me to eat. And we, on the back of a napkin, we came up with the idea of a school.
Were there other churches besides the one on the north side that you utilized for the summer program?
East Liberty Presbyterian Church, the Community of Reconciliation, come to mind. We had it at Allegheny, my first church, for 8 years, 7 or 8 years. And then we did a summer at ELPC, and then we did a summer at the Community of Reconciliation. We did a summer at Shady Side Presbyterian.
Yeah, it was 10 years in all, whatever the number was. What happened was Tom had gotten wooed away from his church on the north side to East Liberty Presbyterian Church, where he was associate or assistant pastor.
I was the pastor, the minister of youth and young adults.
Yeah, at ELPC. So then we transferred everything to ELPC. And then, so while that was going on, and after the back of the napkin, I decided that R.K. Mellon Foundation was the perfect place to go for the initial grant. So I went to R.K. Mellon and met with Scott Izzo, who was terrific, and he talked about the fact that we needed to do a business plan, which I knew, and he said they would fund the business plan. So I quit working. By that time, I was working full-time for an interior, Bird Hill Architectures and Interiors. I was running their interiors division. So I quit. I took a small stipend from the grant that I'd written to R.K. Mellon, cobbled that together with interiors work that I was doing at home, and started to do research on other schools like the one that we might start. And one of the first phone calls I had was with an old friend of mine from Philadelphia who knew someone named John Finley. Now, the only reason I'm telling you the story is John Finley was looking to start a similar school and had just done so, and it was called Epiphany. And that's how I became familiar with the Nativity Model Schools, because Epiphany is a Nativity Model School. And I then met Jack Pozzialdo with the Nativity Schools, and that's how we got involved in that circle of schools. They were doing very much what we wanted to do, only at the middle school level. So I talked about visiting some of those. There was another school in Providence, Rhode Island that we visited. And there was one other model I looked at. I talked to Ted Sizer at Harvard. What you have to realize is this was the late 80s, early 90s, and it was just as charter schools and the charter school movement was booming. And ed schools all over the country were talking about it. There was a guy named Cenzi Grignano who was here, who was at Duquesne, who R.K. Mellon had paid for his position for him to look at and seed charter schools in Pittsburgh. So it was right at a school founding moment in history. So I've often said that God doesn't work just in ones. There are little points of light everywhere that happen, and the Neighborhood Academy sort of rose up out of that stew of what are we going to do about education. So I had a wonderful opportunity, I guess it was over the course of about 6 months, of talking with some extraordinary people who were doing amazing things around the country and sort of synthesizing that and putting it together into the business plan. The grant paid for us to go to Boston. We saw Mother Caroline, we saw Epiphany, we went to New York and saw Nativity Prep in New York. We went to Boston, and I cannot remember the name of that school. It was not a nativity school. It'll come to me at some point.
I think it was in Providence.
It was Providence.
Right, it was...
It starts with a C. I can't remember. Anyway, doesn't matter. So that was it, Boston, New York, and Providence. I came back. Tom put together a curricular plan. I put it all together in a business plan. Went to RK with Tom. Big presentation, ready to ask for the initial round of funding. We'd sent it ahead. Obviously, Scott had read it. We came, I plopped the book down on the table. You're in this wonderful conference room. I sat there and sort of, we went through it with Scott. He looked at the budgets and everything, and I said, so, are you prepared to help us out with the first grant? And he said, no. And I remember it was all I could do to keep my jaw from dropping. I know my eyes just went like that. And he went on to explain that a school like this would need enormous community support, and that if RK gave the first grant, they'd never know whether there was community support for the school or not. So take my little business plan and go out and raise money. Thanks very much, goodbye. That was an extraordinary moment.
it was powerful, I'll put it that way.
And it was the smartest thing he could have done.
I think the initial research that we did, especially into the nativity model, again, it's a model school based on small classrooms. They are Jesuit schools, extended school day, an extended school year. And when you look at the data sociologically, most teenage crime is committed and most teenage pregnancies are conceived after school. Also, for the population that we were committed to serving, the idea of serving 3 meals was crucial. So essentially, we adopted the nativity model, also coupled with the idea of the extended school year, because there's all kinds of data out there that says that kids lose knowledge and skill over the summer. So we became a boarding school without the beds. which was in many ways in the community a tough sell.
Not in many ways, in all ways, I think.
You've got, by and large, the kids came from single parent homes. So mom was used to having her kids around to keep her company, run errands, build in babysitter. Well, after school, they're with us. And again, we built in some pretty high expectations in terms of school culture, behavior, completing work. And
and I think the one thing that we haven't talked about, because we assume it, and we assume you assume it when you hear nativity, but the heart of what we were doing is we're faith-based. So everything stems from, the culture stems from, the work ethic stems from this sense that we are all children of God. We are all important, and that we all need to live into the best gifts that God has given us. And the school is there to help each child discover his or her best and gift and highest purpose.
The idea, well, for me, there was an epiphanal moment. It was the first year, it was either the first or the second year, and Debbie Kroczka, who was our director of counseling services, looked at us and said, what kind of school is, what are our goals? And we both said almost in unison, we're a college preparatory school, of course. And everybody in the room said, college? It's the first we're hearing about this. And that moment really was a very powerful lesson for me, in that if you're in a position of leadership, you can't assume that the people you're working with can read your mind. And it was interesting, once we named the goal of being a college preparatory school, a bunch of things happened. We began to modify our admissions process. The curriculum began to evolve in a certain fashion. We started building in things like college visits. I mean, so the evolution of the school from year 2 to year 21, I think in many ways, began with our naming the goal that we had in mind, the hope that we had in mind.
Would you like to share any particular challenges that you recall while you were growing the school, and memories?
Getting along with Tom?
I whispered under my breath, each other.
Learning how to operate with each other in the same direction was a challenge often. We have very different sensibilities when it comes to...
Everything.
No, I don't think that's true. I think we have different sensibilities when it comes to discipline. What I have learned working with Tom Johnson is that community is more important than the individual. And I think that's a distinctly African approach to community. I think as white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans, we are brought up with this sort of rugged individualism myth, the Marlboro Man, the Horatio Alger story, I can do it on my own. I think particularly today, it's all about me and my success and what it takes for me to achieve my goals. And the African sensibility is, and Tom will say it better, but I am because we are.
That is the proverb.
And that's
implicit.
A very, very different way of looking at the world. And so when a very serious discipline issue would come up, I could figure out ways where we could save the individual. And I do purposely put that in quotes. Tom would be very clear about the idea that the individual had to suffer the consequences of their actions for the good of the community. And what I learned over time was, let's say that this child had to be dismissed, that there would be this communal intake of breath, and this was key, because these were teenagers, these were not middle school kids, a communal intake of breath, and these teenagers would look around and go, whoa, he really means what he says. And consequently, that behavior often never happened again. Now, there was a cost, and there was a cost to Tom, because there were plenty of people yipping in his ear, from the faculty side, from sometimes his partner's side, his colleague's side, from the board, from donors. I mean, that took a huge toll. But I think the school as we see it today exists because Tom was very clear that I am because we are. And I don't think that can be stressed enough. And I hope if no other ethos perpetuates into the future, I hope that one is written in bold letters over every door. The other thing that Tom did, the hardest thing for me was obviously fundraising, particularly in the beginning when nobody believed in the school. And Tom came up with what he used to look at me and he said, this was an old African American proverb. I have not been able to find it anywhere. So I think you might have made it up. But Tom says, the lion takes giant strides in the night, but the path is worn smooth by the feet of the pygmy armies. And so I looked at the donor.
And the pygmies were always on the march.
And I looked at every gift as the path was being worn smooth by the feet of the pygmy armies.
Well, there is. I think those were establishing school culture. I think critical to our success. And what I find interesting is that in business literature these days, and in educational literature, they say culture trumps everything. And I think quite often in schools, they have cultures that are unhealthy because the adults are unwilling to be the adults in relationship with kids and in relationship with parents. So establishing school culture is, I think, crucial. I think another challenge was, and this is especially true with African American boys, there's this emphasis on athletics. And we said, no. Character, achievement, but achievement with honor comes first. I think another challenge is, because we had such high expectations culturally for the school, finding the right faculty who were willing to not be friends with kids, but be the adult in the relationship. It took a while to collect and assemble that faculty.
Well, and part of the difficulty with that, just in fairness to the faculty, most teachers who are attracted to teaching high school kids, particularly in the setting in which we are, and with the kids we're talking about, are young. So there might have been only not even a 10-year difference in age between some of the kids who were learning and the teachers who were teaching them. So it's very difficult for a 25-year-old teacher to not want to be friends with a 16-year-old student. But it was critical.
I think the other challenge was that our teachers were young and they were white. And quite often they were scared of the kids, to be honest with you. I think they were scared of three things. Quite as it's kept, you don't hear a lot of parents who are willing to admit this. Teenagers can arouse in you murderous rage. They really can.
Any of us who've been parents know that.
And so they were uncomfortable with the rage that the kid aroused in them. And so rather than allow themselves to feel that and then use it as fuel to do what they had to do, they were afraid of it. And then there were self-image issues involved, so they eventually took the easy way out
And didn't confront it.
and didn't confront the issue. Confront it. The second issue was that they were afraid if they got really angry with this black kid, it means I'm being insensitive or I'm being a racist. And to be honest with you, black kids will play white teachers like a fiddle like that.
That's something I actually learned in my youth group. My kids told me that. It was really interesting. This was LeVar. We had stopped. We were on the road somewhere, and we were going into a 7-Eleven, and it said only 2 students at once. So LeVar looked at me, goes, "Watch this." He puts up the hood on his jacket. He gets another guy. He goes, "Watch how we scare them." It was eye-opening to me. That's where I learned that lesson.
And then I think there's just a difference in culture, period. We black folk are much more expressive. In child rearing, we were much more confrontational. And a young white faculty was really uncomfortable with, at the risk of sounding patriarchal here, my child rearing practices. And so, again, assembling the appropriate faculty to bring this place to life was a challenge.
And I think all this has to be put in perspective too. We were creating something out of nothing. These
Absolutely.
kids came to our school with a public school mentality, with all the baggage from this is what it was like in my previous school, and they'd all come from a lot of different schools. And so they saw, and the parents as well. So nobody saw any reason to change. So we had to wrest out of this, kind of stew of different kinds of really noxious behaviors, a culture that the school now rests on today. And so today the school is able to do, you can now have a football team because it's already, the partnership, yes, but it's already been established that to be smart for a boy isn't weak or to be white. You can be smart and an athlete. Everything that you see today is accomplished, I believe, on the foundation that was, built of literally blood, sweat, and tears, out of nothing. And largely because Tom could clearly see what had to happen and what had to change in order for that foundation to be built. So
I
that's
think
off to you.
another challenge I think that we faced is there's, I think, a pathology in the black community that to be well-educated, well-spoken, and purposeful is to be white. And I can't tell you the number of times that I had kids tell me, "You're trying to turn us into white Shadyside Academy prep kids."
Just like you.
Just like me. And my response is, if you think to be well-educated is to be white, then what is your definition of blackness? And so one of the things I think, and Jodie recognized this early on, and she was instrumental in building this component into the summer programs that were the ramp up and the pilot to the Neighborhood Academy, is that counseling support was really important. Because there were 2 crucial challenges I think that we had to face all the time. A kid had to learn how to be bicultural. I'll give you an example. Over Christmas break, kid comes in my office, Reverend Tom. Like we taught the kids that when an adult comes in the room, you stand up and you introduce yourself. That's just done. We taught them ladies first. And the longer they were with us, the more their vocabulary expanded. And so a kid was at home over Christmas break, and someone came in the room. He stood up and said, "How are you doing?" And da 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 da. And his family looked at him and said, "You're acting all proper. You're acting like you're white." And the kid came back like, "What do I do with this? What do I do with this?" And so a lot of the counseling support was built around navigating that. The other crisis the kid had to face was, they say in recovery, if you want to get clean and sober, you've got to change people and places. And for at the Neighborhood Academy, a lot of their recovery was having to change people and places. You had to leave friends and some family members behind. And so the kid had to internalize the necessity of that and work their way through the guilt of that. And the third challenge I think that we faced was parents would quite often sabotage their kids because they felt left behind. They saw their child growing, changing, their world expanding, and that would cause, I think on an unconscious level, they would have to start looking at their own lives, which they didn't want to do. Or they were certainly not going to let their child outpace them. Rhetoric to the contrary. So those were extraordinarily difficult challenges to make. Meanwhile, all this turmoil is taking place. And believe me, it was turmoil. While she now has to go out and sell this to people. I've got to say that I would not have been able to do what I did without her. And did we occasionally shake the roof? Absolutely.
I'm not afraid of conflict.
And neither am I. So when it got really heated, we would go out and sit in her Chevy Suburban and hash it out. But this thing called the Neighborhood Academy, as it exists now, would not have come to be without her. And a professional marriage is just like any other marriage. You have to decide at some point, am I going to be right or am I going to be married? And we were able to work that out.
We worked it out because most of the time he needed to be right. I don't know whether you may want to cut this out of the video. My favorite memory is the second year when we were at Champion Commons, and the doors were everything was plywood. I mean, it was just terrible construction. And 5 or 6 of the teenage girls had decided that they were angry with Tom. I can't even remember what they were mad about. And they staged this revolution. And I remember they followed him, and in fact it looked like they were chasing him all the way down this hall into the reception area, which had a door. And Tom turned and he took the door and he went boom. I remember he practically hit one of the girls in the face. I'm sorry, that is one of my favorite memories. It was Janaea. Do you remember? Or no, Janae Hill. It was Janae Hill.
Janae Hill.
Oh my gosh. Oh,
She had gotten upset with me about something I had done or said with one of her sisters, right? And so I had sort of put my arms out and tried to shepherd them out of the reception area. And I went to close the door. And I really wasn't aware that she was pushing back against the door, so I pushed the door and apparently the door together, and she goes flying.
Sharice Wright was in that class, and her daughter is here now. Yeah, it was quite something. I mean, when you talk about culture, You have no idea what every moment was like trying to, yes, those are my fondest memories, actually. And I look at the Champion Commons building now, and then they've torn down St. Lars O'Toole. It makes me so sad. We would worship there every morning.
We'd
That
have
was our gym.
convocation there, we'd have graduation
Yeah.
there.
We used that gym.
My favorite three memories. Anthony, who is now Dr. Williams, was our college counselor. And he had taken the 4 senior girls off to interview at La Roche. And he came back and said, they've all been accepted.
It's our first college group,
And
first graduates.
I remember calling Joe Macera, who was our board chair at the time, and he stopped what he was doing and came over to the school, and he had tears in his eyes. And I can remember all of us looking at each other and saying, we did it. They did it. Top favorite memory. Second favorite memory. Was a mother walking up to me after her son had been admitted to college, and she hugged me and kissed me.
But Derek Thomas is never
Right. Third favorite memory. Opening day here. Because it was proof positive that we had made it. And also, my father was here.
Yeah, he was very proud of you. One of my favorite memories was our first opening day. So on September 11th, 2001, we were still sweeping the contractors out the door at Champion Commons. And of course, the televisions were on and the world changed. Our opening day ceremonies were September 12th, the very next day. And we'd set out, 150 invitations. And the mayor was supposed to come. And we looked at each other and we wondered, first of all, should we open? And then after talking to board members and others, we decided we should open because it's a moment of hope. So 9 o'clock came the next morning, and I'll never forget, Clark Miller was standing at the big Champion Commons windows, and the sills were high. And he was standing at the window, and he had his back to me with his hands like this, and he was looking out the window. And I was back farther into the cafeteria, and I heard him say, well, the mayor's coming. I said, Clark, how do you know? He's not gonna come. He said, yep, he's coming. I said, how do you know? He said, they're the street sweepers going up Penn Avenue. Sure enough, the mayor arrived, and so did 100 and some odd other of our friends, and we had the most extraordinary opening ceremony service and ribbon cutting that I think could have been possible. People were weeping and crying, and it just was this moment that said we were affirming life and light and hope in the shadow of 9/11. So that's a memory that I will never forget. And my other favorite story is one of our graduates' mother, who was a lovely, lovely woman. We both loved her, and she was crazy about Reverend Tom. And her son had been guilty of stealing?
Multiple offenses.
Multiple offenses of stealing. So Tom called her in and called the young man in who did graduate and has gone on to do great things. And I think you need to finish the story.
So she comes into my office, and he's there. And so this was a kick my feet up on the desk moment. And I looked at him and said, go ahead,
Tell your mother.
tell your mother. And he looked at me and said, I didn't make this mess, you did. Tell your mother. And she said, tell me what? So he then proceeds to tell her what he had done. And she gets this incredulous look on her face. You did what? And all of a sudden, she jumps up out of the chair and grabs him. And then she took her purse and went, boom! She hit him with it. I thought, okay, one shot, he's got that coming, no problem. Before I knew it, boom, again. And then she reaches back by a third. At that point, it's like, feet off the desk. No, you can't do that. You can't do that in front of me. And it took Anthony and I, both of us, to get this small woman who was not much bigger than Jodie to get her off.
Oh, she was so mad at me. He had embarrassed her. She taught him differently. The Neighborhood Academy has been the child that I birthed.
The Neighborhood Academy has been that place where my great joy meets the world's great need, my vocation. Happy birthday! No.
Is it anniversary?
Happy
21st anniversary!
Neighborhood Academy. Let's do it one more time.
Happy 21st
Shall I write it on the whiteboard?
Actually, that's not a bad idea.
Tough. Say it.
Happy
21st.
Happy 21st anniversary, Neighborhood Academy.